This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Centra AI. Build, grow, and scale your business with a team of AI employees. On January 26, 1944, Argentina officially severed diplomatic relations with Germany and Japan. It was a notable shift for a country that had significant economic ties with both the Axis and the Allies, and which had attempted to maintain a policy of neutrality longer than most nations found tenable in the largest conflict in human history. The tale of Argentina split with the Axis is a very strange tale of espionage and diplomacy and competing interests in a part of the world that seemed far removed from the battlefields of Europe. You know, the History Guy is really a small business, but the business part of that, making the videos for YouTube, that takes up most of my time. And I've got a couple of employees, but everybody has plenty to do. There's not enough time in the day, and there's not enough room in the budget for more employees. And I think a lot of small businesses are in that same boat. So today's episode is brought to you by Centra AI. And I know people say a lot about AI, but the bottom line is AI is a tool. So why not let that tool work for your business? Centra AI is an AI-driven platform that acts as a virtual team of specialized AI assistants, or AI employees, if you will, that can help businesses, especially small and medium-sized businesses like mine, streamline and automate your daily processes. But instead of one generic AI, Centra offers a suite of 12-plus role-specific helpers, such as a copywriter, a social media manager, a sales manager, a data analyst, each powered by the most powerful AI models and pre-trained for distinct business functions. For example, Buddy, my AI business manager, is out seeking partnership opportunities beyond YouTube. Things like local historical societies or educational institutions that might want to work with the History Guy. It's a great idea. I just never have time to do the research. While Soshi, my social media coordinator, is helping me to create social media posts for platforms that I tend to neglect because I don't have the time. I'm still in charge. They're just doing the legwork, which is weird because they don't have legs. But your data is secure, stored securely on the cloud with encryption. You get 24/7 support, and if you don't love it, you can get a full refund within 14 days. So go to centra.ai/thehistoryguy and use the code thehistoryguy for a limited time offer of 72% off plans. Build, grow, and scale your business with a team of AI employees with centra.ai. The interest in Latin America as war broke out in Europe could be described as complex. Large numbers of Europeans, many from what would be Axis nations, immigrated to Latin America between the 1880s and the 1930s. Decades of American military adventures had fostered distrust with the United States. Latin American economies had been hard hit in the worldwide Great Depression, and trade with partners, including Europe, was seen as particularly important to economic recovery. The region generally was developing more nationalist character and a public desire for independence. Meanwhile, as the world was already dividing between what would become the Allies and the Axis, the great powers were already expressing their interest in the region, which had various strategic and economic interests. John F. Bratzel, a professor of writing and American studies at Michigan State University, editor of Latin America During World War II, published in 2007, wrote, "The war affected the whole world. Even citizens in nations and regions where no fighting took place or were not central to the actual war had their society and history significantly altered. The Latin American states are in this group. Each nation had responded in its own way to World War II. The United States became concerned about Axis influence in Latin America before America had joined the war and engaged in diplomatic efforts to establish a pan-American movement that ensured that Latin American nations would align with the United States. Historian Gerald K. Haynes wrote in a 1977 edition of Diplomatic History. Increasingly anxious over the spread of Nazi-fascist ideology and propaganda in the Americas, and convinced that these anti-democratic forces seriously jeopardized the position of the United States in the Western Hemisphere, the administration of Franklin Roosevelt during the 1930s and early 1940s devised and implemented a broad program to cleanse the hemisphere of all traces of Axis influence. One step was the good neighbor policy of the Roosevelt administration. The Office of the Historian of the Department of State writes, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office determined to improve relations with the nations of Central and South America. Under his leadership, the United States emphasized cooperation and trade rather than military force to maintain stability in the hemisphere. The good neighbor policy was intended to distance the United States from the frequent military interventions by the United States that had occurred from the last decades of the 19th century through the early decades of the 20th, the period called the Banana Wars. Officially enunciated in his first inaugural address on March 4, 1933, the tangible effect of the policy was the December 26, 1933 Montevideo Convention. Ratified originally by 17 nations of the Americas, among its provisions was a commitment to non-intervention. No state has the right to intervene in the internal or external affairs of another. This Pan-American unity was further established in the Havana Conference of 1940. Held in July, the conference was the result of the ongoing war in Europe and a particular concern, as Thomas N. Leonard explains in the Encyclopedia of U.S. and Latin American Relations. The immediate concern was the disposition of French and Dutch holdings in the Caribbean and Central America. The United States wanted to ensure that Germany could not use these outposts in the Western Hemisphere to bring war to American shores. The convention included an agreement that any territory belonging to a state that had been taken over by the Axis would be jointly administered, and that no territory would be transferred to Axis control. More importantly, the convention established a pact of mutual defense, stating that any attempt on the part of non-American state against the integrity or inviolability of the territory, the sovereignty, or the political independence of an American state shall be considered as an act of aggression against the states which signed this declaration. At the same time, the United States created the Office of Inter-American Affairs. Victoria Giron of the University of Virginia wrote in a 2018 blog of the Library of Congress, "The Office of Inter-American Affairs, OIAA, was created in 1940 to coordinate the activities of the U.S. government in Latin America. The OIAA hoped to increase economic cooperation and interdependence between the United States and Latin America. The office also became heavily involved in disseminating information through the radio, motion picture, and press media. The office was established, according to Executive Order 8840, to provide for the development of commercial and cultural relations between the American republics, and thereby increasing the solidarity of this hemisphere and furthering the spirit of cooperation between the Americas in the interest of hemispheric defense." Economic ties were of particular importance, as Latin American nations were facing economic uncertainty as trade with Europe was disrupted during the war. But that doesn't mean that the Axis had not found a foothold. The aforementioned propaganda had struck a chord with some nationalists, and Nazi Germany had a particular interest. A 1946 review from the United States Office of Naval Intelligence explains, after the outbreak of war in Europe, and particularly after the fall of France, it became of increasing importance for Germany to obtain intelligence on the nature and extent of equipment being sent to Great Britain, data on ship sailings, and the war potential of the United States. Much of this was readily available from press and other open sources in the United States to German diplomatic personnel. To supplement these sources and evade British censorship, the Abwehr, Military Intelligence Service, established espionage networks in Mexico and other Latin American countries, which relayed information from the United States to Germany by radio and other clandestine communications. These German spy operations operated under the code name Operation Bolivar. The Office of Naval Intelligence explains that the efforts found some success. During this period, between the outbreak of war in Europe and Pearl Harbor, the Abwehr succeeded in establishing a number of espionage networks in South America. These were centered in Brazil, Chile, and Argentina, with ramifications in other countries. Brazil had a particularly large German diaspora, and so was a center of operations. The Office of Naval Intelligence continues. Through organizations in Brazil itself, staffed by members of the well-entrenched German colony, information was collected on British shipping and forwarded by clandestine radio to Germany. Similar information from the River Plate region collected by agents in Argentina was relayed through the Brazil stations. The Brazil group also acted as relays for information of a more general nature, including intelligence originating in the United States, forwarded by agents in Mexico, Ecuador, and Chile. The group also had its own contacts on ships between the United States and Brazil. Their use of channels along the west coast of South America and connections with Europe via clandestine radio and the Latin airline, these scattered but interrelated groups were able to escape British censorship and maintain safe and reasonably rapid contact with Abwehr stations in Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin. During 1940 and 1941, these groups must be credited with accomplishments which were probably of considerable value to Germany. Not only did they forward a quantity of basic economic data useful in Nazi analyses, but the shipping information supplies resulted in the loss to submarines of British and Allied ships. But then came Pearl Harbor, and owing to growing economic ties with the U.S., the loss of trade with Germany owing to the British blockade and the commitments made in Havana, many Latin American nations broke diplomatic ties with the Axis and joined the Declaration of United Nations, officially joining the Allies in the war. Giron explains, many people who learn about World War II are taught about the participation of the United States and Great Britain in the Allied war effort. While most people may be aware that the Greater Allied War effort involved the participation of many European countries, few people know that several Latin American countries were also formal allies in World War II. One primary goal was to shut down the German intelligence operations, the Office of Naval Intelligence writes. The activities of these espionage groups in Latin America had not gone unnoticed by United States and British counterintelligence agencies, but prior to Pearl Harbor, there was little that could be done about them. During the early months of 1942, active steps were taken to correlate this information, identify those agents who were still unknown, and persuade local police authorities to arrest, intern, or deport them. In an era before the Central Intelligence Agency, Roosevelt turned to the FBI, the website of the Federal Bureau of Investigation explains. By 1940, South America had become a hotbed of German intrigue. More than 500,000 German immigrants, many supporters of the Third Reich, had settled in Brazil and Argentina alone. Roosevelt wanted to keep an eye on Nazi activities in our neighbors to the south, and when the U.S. joined the Allied cause in 1941, he wanted to protect our nation from Hitler's spies and collect intelligence on Axis activities to help win the war. The president turned to the FBI to run the Special Intelligence Service, and we ended up sending more than 340 agents and support professionals undercover into Central and South America over the next 7 years. The Office of Naval Intelligence writes, as a result of these efforts, the leaders of the Brazilian rings were arrested in March 1942, and Germany was never again successful in establishing an effective espionage service in Brazil. The SIS, along with signal intercepts from British intelligence, the Navy, and the Coast Guard, found varying degrees of cooperation and success in different countries, but a major obstacle was Argentina. Reporter Leonardo Torresi wrote in a 2025 edition of the Buenos Aires Times, Argentina had been left alone in the Americas. Some 20 nations had severed relations with the Axis, and 7 of them had declared war on it in the middle of the conflict. A 1997 U.S. Department of State summary explains, Argentina, alone among the American republics, pursued neutrality in World War II. Argentine neutrality collided directly with U.S. objectives towards Latin America. The American perspective tends to tie Argentine neutrality to pro-Nazi sympathies. Argentina had been a Spanish colony and had large populations of Italian and German immigrants. A State Department record from the time explains, when war broke out in Europe in 1939, there was a very large German population in Argentina. Some 60,000 of them belonged to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, an organization of Germans living abroad. This organization controlled shipping lines, a special news service, and other entities in Argentina. Germans also had a great economic influence in Argentina, controlling a considerable part of the nation's industrial, chemical, pharmaceutical, and electrical goods production, and having a large part of the military and civilian construction. Thus, it's not surprising that Argentina pursued a neutral policy after the United States entered the war in December 1941. It failed to induce Chile, Paraguay, and Peru to form a neutral bloc, but it did continue to defy United States pressure to align itself with the Allies and ignored Allied recommendations and declarations to end all financial interaction, direct or indirect, with Nazi Germany. But that is an oversimplification, as Argentina had other reasons to maintain neutrality. The 1997 summary explains freedom of action and its relations with European nations was the keystone of Argentina's foreign policy traditions. Its neutrality during World War I had been domestically popular and made the Argentine economy prosper. It wanted to revitalize its economy after the disastrous impact of the Great Depression, and it saw itself as a counterweight in the South to the United States in the North. But a significant factor in Argentine neutrality was, ironically, another ally, the United Kingdom. Hiroshi Matsushita of the Institute of Developing Economies notes, Argentina had such close economic links with Great Britain since the 19th century that she was sometimes called the Sixth Dominion. Argentina's policy was to oppose Pan-American movement, which might hurt Argentine economic relations. In the 1930s, the US and UK were competing for Argentine markets. Argentina leaned towards the UK partly because the nation saw itself as a counter to American power in the Americas, but also because the US was an agricultural state and did not need and competed with Argentine beef exports. The UK, on the other hand, was dependent upon Argentina for its beef. This led to an odd conflict of interest between the two allies. The US wanted the Americas unified against fascism, but the UK was willing to accept Argentine neutrality so long as exports continued. In fact, there was an advantage to neutrality, as that made exports less likely to be attacked. The UK was willing to accept some Argentine trade with Berlin in exchange for maintaining its own vital supply line. And in the early war, Argentina became concerned that Britain might be defeated. Matsushita explains even if Britain were defeated, if Argentina remained neutral, Germany would be their best customer. The decision was also highly political. President Ramon Castillo had taken office after President Roberto Ortiz had resigned in 1942. Castillo's power depended upon holding together a coalition of traditional conservatives composed of agricultural landholders and the military. Matsushita explains that the landholders were generally pro-British, not pro-German, but were anti-American, as America offered little market for Argentine beef. This stand of neutrality also helped Castillo versus his greatest political rival, former President Agustin Justo, whose relatively pro-Allied stand separated him from these landholders. As Justo was a military officer, Castillo had to seek the support of the pro-Axis faction of the military. Matsushita explains, this group was a rival of the Justo faction within the military. So, naturally, Castillo wanted to consolidate his power by reducing Justo's, aligning with the pro-Axis military. Thus, Matsushita writes, Castillo's neutralism was based upon an alliance of contradictory forces. The UK was fine with the arrangement so long as beef imports could continue, but neutrality offered some problems. The 1997 State Department report notes, Nazi Germany supported Argentina's neutrality, although Nazi Germany's strategic motives in Argentina were unclear. Its economic motives were clear. Germany desired to keep Argentina neutral for both commercial and financial advantages, and possibly as a destination for looted gold. And neutrality did help the Nazi government. The State Department writes, the Allied wartime blockade made it impossible for Argentina to provide substantial amounts of exports to Germany, which up until then had been one of its principal trading partners. But Buenos Aires, however, was one of the principal Latin American ports from which goods valuable even in small quantities, such as platinum, palladium, drugs, and other chemicals, were smuggled to the Axis. Moreover, this state of affairs offered an opportunity for Operation Bolivar and a problem for the SIS. The FBI website explains, one of the exceptions was Argentina, which as a result of its policies distanced itself from the U.S. and drew itself closer diplomatically to Germany. This meant that Argentina was a hotbed of intrigue, and it proved to be a tougher environment for members of the FBI's Special Intelligence Service, the U.S. intelligence component whose mission was to identify and counter Nazi operatives in South America. The eventual shift in Argentina's policy, however, came through unexpected means. In June of 1943, Castillo was overthrown in a military coup, largely as a response to corruption in government and Castillo's attempt to name his own replacement. The military government that came to power was, however, a nationalist government and seen as being pro-Axis. Their initial action was to maintain neutrality. But in December 1943, the new government supported a right-wing takeover in Bolivia. The move was a breaking point, the 1997 State Department summary explains. Armed with evidence that the Argentine military regime had sponsored the overthrow and was plotting similar coups in other South American countries, the United States took several measures to escalate pressure on Argentina to break relations with the Axis, including sending ships from the South Atlantic Fleet to the vicinity of Buenos Aires, moving to freeze Argentine assets. This was aided by the efforts of the SIS. Despite lack of support from the Argentine government, the SIS had managed to work with friendly local agencies and provide proof of the activities of German spies. This gave the struggling and increasingly isolated government the excuse to do what Teresi describes as a historic turnaround. The State Department writes, on January 26, 1944, the government of President Ramirez, citing evidence of growing Nazi espionage ring in Argentina, announced it was severing formal diplomatic relations with the Axis powers. It was, ironically, the Germans' own spy network that eventually brought Argentina to join the Allies. Thus, the evolving politics and eventually Germany's own spy networks ended Argentina's neutrality. The next change came in March of 1945. Teresi writes, when the outcome of the great struggle was already certain, the decision came. Decree 6945 made public on March 27, 1945. Argentina officially declared war on Germany and Japan. Too late, of course, to partake in combat. This decision was driven by a particular member of the government, Teresi notes. One of the figures who most influenced the change in Argentina's position was Juan Domingo Perón. He saw what was coming in August 1944 when he was war minister. The late shift not only allowed Argentina to participate in the 1945 San Francisco Conference, where Allied nations planned the post-war world, but, Teresi notes, among the things seen by Perón was something more concrete. By abandoning neutrality, Argentina was entitled to seize assets and property in the country. The government confiscated German and Japanese-owned companies and banks. Thus, it was a number of often competing relationships that resulted both in Argentina's neutrality and Argentina abandoning that neutrality. It was a process that was chock full of irony, as actions often had unintended consequences. One of the unintended consequences was the rise of Peronism, which would have a significant impact on post-war Argentina. And that again was an irony, as the United States ended up in largely an adversarial relationship with the man that our policy had helped bring to power. By joining the war so late, Argentina was able to benefit largely from being one of the allies with giving little in return, but there was a cost. The Argentine military did not benefit nearly as much from the substantial American lend-lease as other Latin American nations did. In another ironic twist, Brazil was among the most active supporters of the Allies, sending both ground and air forces that participated in combat in Europe. One reason that Brazil was a greater participant in the Allied cause was to gain military advantage over Argentina, where Argentina's neutrality was viewed with suspicion. And a final irony might be that the success of the FBI's SIS, which was disbanded when the war was over and the Central Intelligence Agency was created, might actually turn out to be quite hollow. As U.S. National Security Administration historian Henry Shorak noted in 1989, the espionage activities of the Germans in Latin America ended up having negligible impact on the Second World War, and the U.S. perception of the threat was much greater than the actual threat. He writes, "One might also comment upon the extraordinary activity between and among American intelligence organizations in the face of so small and unsuccessful a German effort." I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.